Have you ever wondered what truly endangers our world? Is it hatred, corruption, or the desire for control? Or could it be something much more subtle, something that hides openly before us? What if the real threat isn't the evil plotting behind closed doors, but rather the crowd that follows unquestioningly? Not the dictator giving orders, but the masses that comply. This is a troubling idea because it assigns responsibility not only to the malicious, but also to those who are indifferent, silent, or unaware. Yet, this uncomfortable reality was revealed by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was more than a thinker. He was a man of action, a pastor, and theologian grounded in Christian principles. Bonhoeffer witnessed his country descend into darkness. He lived through Hitler's rise, saw moral foundations crumble, and observed neighbors, co-workers, and even church leaders become complicit in terrible crimes, not necessarily out of evil intent, but because they stopped thinking independently. While imprisoned and awaiting execution, Bonhoeffer wrote what would become one of the 20th century's most profound and urgent reflections. He recognized that societal collapse does not start with hatred, it begins with stupidity. This was not an insult to intelligence or education. He wasn't criticizing the uneducated or naive. Instead, he was identifying a far more dangerous condition, a spiritual and moral surrender. Bonhoeffer stated that stupidity is a greater threat to good than malice.
Why?
Because malice is identifiable, it has a face, a name, and can be confronted. A malicious person understands their actions and chooses to do harm. But the stupid individual Bonhoeffer described is unaware of their role. They accept what they are told, repeat what they hear, and follow the group's rhythm without questioning where they are headed or why. Worse, they often feel justified. That is why stupidity is more dangerous than evil. It is unaware of itself, making it almost impossible to oppose. Bonhoeffer noticed a frightening change in those around him. People who had once seemed reasonable, kind, and intelligent began to. People became unrecognizable. They adopted slogans without question. They rejected reason and accepted cruelty without hesitation, as long as it was presented under the guise of patriotism or ideology. This was not a matter of individual evil, it was something else, a contagion affecting groups like a virus. It created a psychological haze that clouded judgment, erased empathy, and replaced personal conscience with automatic obedience. Bonhoeffer recognized this was more than just ignorance, it was a collective phenomenon, a system of mindless behavior. He argued that stupidity is not a fixed trait, but a state people fall into. It is not that individuals are born stupid, he explained, but that they allow themselves to become so by surrendering their independence of thought. This realization is alarming because it means no one is truly safe or exempt. We become genuinely stupid the moment we relinquish responsibility for our own thinking. Here is a crucial point that many miss. Bonhoeffer didn't simply analyze stupidity, he observed how it is exploited. Stupidity isn't just harmful on its own, it serves as a tool. A tool wielded by dictators, manipulators, and propaganda machines. A passive population is the ideal for any authoritarian regime. Why bother enforcing control through fear when obedience can be secured by switching off people's capacity to think? Bonhoeffer saw that evil doesn't have to convince people, it only needs to distract them. It only needs to make them comfortable enough to stop questioning, to cease thinking, and to delegate their moral judgment to the crowd, to the party, to the flag. Once this happens, truth loses its importance, facts are dismissed, logic is perceived as hostility, and evil moves freely, disguised as virtue. So where does this process start? Not with war, nor with violence, but with the gradual loss of personal responsibility, the weakening of the inner voice, the dulling of the mind. People begin to repeat what they hear without reflection. Not because they agree, but because it's easier, people accept narratives without questioning, not out of genuine belief, but due to exhaustion. Over time, they lose the ability to distinguish right from wrong, not because they become malicious, but because they stop seeking the truth. This is what frightened Bonhoeffer the most, not only the actions of the wicked, but the silence of the many. Bonhoeffer recognized something many still fail to understand. Stupidity is not merely a lack of intelligence, nor is it an inherent condition. Instead, it is something cultivated, often intentionally, often quietly. In his letters from prison, he wrote that stupidity is not an intellectual flaw, but a moral failing. At first, this idea may seem counterintuitive. We tend to believe that intelligent people think independently, that education shields us from manipulation, and that knowledge alone preserves freedom. However, Bonhoeffer observed the opposite. He saw professors, clergy, artists, and everyday people all succumb to ideology, not because of a lack of intellect, but because they abandoned critical thinking. They allowed something else to think for them. What makes stupidity particularly dangerous, Bonhoeffer argued, is that it is not merely an individual issue, it's a social one. A person may be capable of reasoning, questioning, and making ethical choices when alone, but once immersed in a group, once enveloped in collective belief, that same individual might lose both the ability and the desire to think independently. Bonhoeffer believed this is how evil progresses in modern society, not only through overt wickedness, but through the passive compliance of minds disconnected from their own judgment. The chilling truth he exposed is that stupidity can be deliberately nurtured by those in power, and that power, leadership that aims for control, rarely desires citizens who think independently. Instead, it prefers followers. Followers aren't naturally born, they are shaped. This shaping doesn't occur in formal training centers or classrooms. It happens through media influence, repetition, fear, comfort, and slogans that replace logical debate. Symbols take the place of ethics, and crowds substitute for conscience. Gradually, people start conforming, not necessarily because they believe in what's happening, but because they stop noticing their own doubts. Bonhoeffer observed this in Nazi Germany, where the nation's change wasn't abrupt but slow and subtle. It started with small compromises, accepting minor lies, overlooking small injustices, staying silent when it was important to speak up. Eventually, people became cogs in a machine they no longer recognized, a machine that exploited their obedience to commit acts they would have once found unthinkable. However, fear alone didn't drive this shift. It was also a false sense of security, the comfort of belonging, and the illusion of certainty. Bonhoeffer understood that people become most vulnerable to foolishness when they feel safe within a group and no longer feel accountable for the consequences of their own choices. In this state, truth loses importance. Individuals stop judging right from wrong, real from false, and instead accept whatever ideas are socially rewarded at the moment. They stop thinking independently and instead are thought by external forces. What makes this type of ignorance so dangerous is that it reinforces itself. The more deeply someone is embedded in a group's belief system, the harder it becomes to question it. Doubt feels like betrayal, curiosity seems risky, and rational thought is no longer just inconvenient, it becomes an act of treason. Those who speak out are branded enemies, not necessarily because they are wrong, but because they threaten the fragile unity of the group. Bonhoeffer's work reveals a chilling contradiction. The more totalitarian a regime becomes, the more it depends on ignorance to survive. It demands that people close their eyes, cover their ears, and cheer for their own oppression. Yet, the regime can't openly admit this. Instead, it masks ignorance as virtue. Blind obedience is labeled patriotism, loyalty to propaganda is called truth, and silence is deemed peace. In this twisted reality, where lies are dressed as goodness, those who think critically become threats. This is why Bonhoeffer argued that stupidity is not just more dangerous than evil, it is its servant. Stupidity allows evil to thrive unnoticed. It acts as a shield, separating those in power from the repercussions of their deeds. It turns moral offenses into simple administrative duties, converts injustice into official policy, replaces cruelty with mere figures, and transforms suffering into data points. All this happens while most people watch, nodding along, repeating what they hear, and taking part, without ever recognizing what they have become. Even more troubling is that those trapped in this mindset often consider themselves morally superior. They believe they are right because they are surrounded by others who think the same. They confuse agreement with truth and applause for justice. So, when someone tries to reason, to question the system, or point out serious problems, they are not only ignored, they are met with hostility. As Bonhoeffer observed, the mind trapped in stupidity is closed to dialogue, uninterested in learning, and unreachable by logic. It builds a protective barrier of slogans, rituals, and borrowed certainty, inside which it feels secure. This is the tragedy Bonhoeffer warned about. In times of crisis, it is not just the villains we should fear, but the millions of ordinary people who support them, not because they are evil, but because they refuse to think. The person who repeats lies unquestioningly, who obeys without reflection, who chooses comfort over truth, becomes a tool of destruction, often unknowingly. Bonhoeffer's insight was not only for his era, it applies to ours as well. In a world filled with noise, where opinions are mass-produced, and critical thinking is rare, we must ask ourselves, are we truly thinking, or are we being thought? Are our actions driven by conscience or convenience? Are we resisting the system, or are we part of it? Because the truth is, stupidity does not arrive all at once. It begins slowly, when we look away, stop asking why, and remain silent because it is easier. By the time we notice what we have become, we may already be part of something far more dangerous than we imagined. There was a question that haunted Bonhoeffer throughout his life, especially in the silence of his prison cell. How can one stay free in a world that demands obedience? When stupidity spreads like a virus, and the crowd becomes the voice of truth, how can we? For Bonhoeffer, preserving one's own voice and mind was essential. He did not advocate rebellion merely for rebellion's sake. He rejected reckless defiance or loud opposition. Instead, he called for something far more challenging: inner clarity. This kind of resistance begins not with external action, but with awareness. In a society founded on automatic conformity, the most radical act is to think independently. Bonhoeffer believed the first step to resisting foolishness is recognizing when it is occurring. This recognition demands courage, not only intellectual courage but moral bravery as well. It's easy to believe we are free simply because we hold certain opinions or disagree with the majority on some topics. However, true freedom, according to Bonhoeffer, is not about having opinions. It is about possessing both the ability and the willingness to examine those opinions, to trace them back to their origins, and to ask, do I genuinely believe this, or am I simply repeating what I have been taught? Most people never pose this question, and that is precisely what allows foolishness to persist: the automatic repetition of ideas, the refusal to question, and the fear of social rejection. These factors become invisible bars in a mental prison. Bonhoeffer's theory offers no comfort. It challenges the idea that we are as independent as we imagine. Much of what we call belief is, in fact, inherited emotion disguised as thought. So, what does true freedom mean? Bonhoeffer's answer is subtle yet revolutionary. It means taking responsibility for your conscience. It means refusing to outsource it to authority, refusing to drown it in distraction, and refusing to shield it behind ideology. Instead, it means carrying your conscience with you, awake and aware, even when it comes at a cost. Especially when it comes at a cost. Bonhoeffer argued that a truly free person isn't simply someone who says whatever they want, but rather someone who stays aware while others remain unaware. He defined freedom as an internal state developed through reflection, silence, discipline, and moral responsibility. In this sense, freedom is not something natural or automatic. It must be earned and actively protected. Not through force, but through careful and continuous vigilance of the mind. This is where his spiritual foundation plays a crucial role. For Bonhoeffer, resisting ignorance was more than just an intellectual challenge. It was a spiritual duty, a commitment to truth that transcended popular opinion or collective trends. He believed that when the majority loses direction, individuals must reconnect with a deeper moral core, one grounded not in the changing tides of the era but in timeless principles. For him, this core was rooted in faith, not blind faith, nor organized religion, but a personal lived experience of truth that stood against the fabricated lies of the regime. Still, he acknowledged this was not easy. He understood how difficult it is to think independently amid constant noise. He recognized that loneliness is the cost of those who refuse to conform. But he also understood that conformity carries a far greater cost: the loss of one's identity, the dulling of the spirit, the quiet, unseen surrender of one's deepest beliefs in exchange for the safety of agreement. Bonhoeffer witnessed what happens when entire nations exchange integrity for a sense of belonging, when people betray their own reason to avoid standing alone. He observed how those who once ridiculed absurdities eventually come to echo them. Citizens who once called out madness later became its defenders. Because once you accept something you know is wrong, it becomes easier to keep accepting it until you forget what wrong even means. Bonhoeffer's aim was not only to analyze this decline but to warn and awaken us, to show that the strongest resistance to evil isn't found in anger or rebellion, but in the refusal to become ignorant. In the refusal to shut down the mind, turn away from conscience, or pretend not to see reality. He wrote that true resistance starts when a person internally decides, "I will not take part in the lie." Not necessarily by loud protest or dramatic acts, but quietly and firmly, with clear eyes and a steady mind. That single choice to stay aware can change a life, and over time, potentially change the world. Most people never make that choice, not because they are wicked, nor because they lack courage, but because they have never recognized the power of their own awareness. They have never been taught to view their mind as a tool or their silence as a form of consent. Instead, they drift through life, absorbing the opinions of others, confusing popular agreement with clear understanding, and convincing themselves they are free simply because they never attempt to break free. Bonhoeffer's prison writings serve as a quiet challenge to this complacency, a call to awaken, to think critically again, and to reclaim the soul from the systems that aim to consume it. He did not write to comfort our generation. He wrote to confront us. And if we find the courage to truly listen, we may realize that his words, though penned in captivity, rank among the most liberating ever recorded. His lesson is straightforward, unsettling, yet profound. Evil does not require monstrous villains to prevail. It only needs people who are distracted, too comfortable, or too obedient to recognize what they have become. There is a type of evil that announces itself loudly. It marches, shouts, brandishes weapons, and displays flags, uniforms, and symbols. Because of this, we know how to resist it. We can identify it, oppose it, and stand against it. But another threat is quieter, subtler, and far more persistent. It doesn't break down doors or burn books in public, at least not initially. It begins as a whisper, a shared joke, a slogan repeated without thought, a minor compromise made because the fight seems unnecessary. It lives in the shrug, the turning away, the unspoken agreement to overlook too much. This is the danger Dietrich Bonhoeffer feared most, not the violence of the powerful, but the passivity of the many, not the cruelty of the wicked, but the silence of the crowd, not the schemes of the malevolent, but the disconnection of ordinary people. Bonhoeffer understood that for evil to thrive, it doesn't require an army of demons, only a society that has forgotten how to think. A population conditioned to obey, a public trained to value comfort over truth, entertainment over wisdom, and safety over freedom. In such a world, stupidity is not an accident. It is intentional, a consequence, and a symptom of something deeper. But this ignorance is not easily recognized because it wears many disguises: patriotism, optimism, loyalty, even kindness. It often comes disguised as the language of unity, progress, tradition, and morality often wears a disguise. Under this mask, it persuades well-intentioned people to support systems they would never have created, and defend wrongs they never imagined they'd justify. What makes this especially tragic is that most people involved don't realize what they've become. They truly believe they're doing the right thing, that they stand on the side of truth. But somewhere along the way, they lose their connection to something vital, the internal thread linking them to their own conscience. Once that bond is severed, it no longer matters how intelligent, educated, or well-meaning a person is. Without that inner voice, they become an echo, just a mirror reflecting the world around them, a tool used by others. This is what Bonhoeffer meant when he said that stupidity is more dangerous than malice. Malice, at least, has a center. It can be recognized and opposed. But stupidity lacks that core. It floats, shifts, absorbs whatever is most convenient, most rewarded, or most amplified. In doing so, it becomes a blank page, ready to be filled by whatever hand holds the pen. So what can we do? This is where Bonhoeffer's voice, even long after his death, remains strikingly clear. He never offered simple answers. He wasn't a preacher of slogans. He didn't claim that independent thinking would lead to an easier life. In fact, he understood it would do the opposite. It would separate you from the crowd, weigh heavily on your conscience, and force you to see what others choose to ignore. Yet he believed that this burden is what brings us fully to life. To resist stupidity, we must begin by taking ownership of our own minds. We must learn to sit with discomfort, to question even the beliefs we cherish, to be skeptical of any narrative that comes without self-examination. We must create space for complexity, for nuance, for contradiction, because truth is rarely loud and almost never simple. We must also embrace solitude, not as isolation, but as clarity. Bonhoeffer understood that the most deceptive lies often emerge from the crowd, and that if truth speaks at all, it speaks quietly. In solitude, we remember what is real. There, we can hear a voice that wasn't handed to us by others, a voice that belongs to us alone, a voice that existed before the world began shaping it. And finally, we must be willing to stand alone, even briefly, if that is what integrity demands. We need the courage to speak calmly while others yell, to take a step back while the crowd surges forward, to say no when the world insists on yes. This isn't rebellion for the sake of defiance. It's something far more important, the protection of conscience in times of darkness. Bonhoeffer's life ended in a concentration camp. He was executed because he refused to be part of a regime built on falsehoods. He did not live to see its collapse. He gained no wealth, no influence, no widespread recognition during his life. But he preserved something far rarer, his freedom. He died with a clear mind, an unclouded spirit, and a conscience untouched by fear or conformity. And that may be the deepest form of victory. In a letter written not long before his death, Bonhoeffer offered this powerful thought. We are not merely to bandage the wounds of the victims beneath the wheels of injustice. We are to drive a spoke into the wheel itself. This isn't just a call to action, it's a call to awaken. A call to see with clarity. To remember that history is not shaped by those who follow blindly, but by those who choose to think, even when thinking becomes dangerous. Today, in a world overwhelmed by noise, division, confusion, and manipulation, Bonhoeffer's warning feels more relevant than ever. The greatest threat to our future may not come from tyrants or extremists, but from the gradual erosion of thought, from our willingness to give up reason, from the rise of stupidity disguised as strength, and silence mistaken for virtue. And so, we are faced with a choice, not between left or right, good or evil, but between waking and sleeping. Between the hard, slow path of reflection and the easy fall into blind obedience. May we find the courage to choose thought, to choose clarity, to choose truth, even when it costs us, because in a world that counts on our silence, the most revolutionary act is simply to stay awake. The most dangerous victories of evil are won not by its masterminds, but by those who never realized they were helping it.